Highbridge, a division of Recorded Books, presents American Inheritance, Liberty and Slavery in the Birth of a Nation, 1765 to 1795, by Edward J. Larson. Read by David de Vries. Preface. The role of liberty and slavery in the American Revolution is a partisan minefield. Drawing on a popular narrative presenting the expansion of liberty as a driving force in American history, some on the right dismiss the role of slavery in the founding of the Republic. Appealing to a progressive narrative of economic self-interest and racial and gender bias in American history, some on the left see the defense of state-sanctioned slavery as a cause of the Revolution and an effect of the Constitution. Public debate over the place of liberty and slavery in the Revolutionary era has opened the way for rigorous historical scholarship to examine the subject in the tradition of such time-tested classics as Edmund Morgan's 1975 American Slavery, American Freedom, and Benjamin Quarles's 1961 The Negro in the American Revolution. Where Morgan focused on 17th-century Virginia and Quarles concentrated on blacks in the military, this book centers on the 30 core years of the Revolutionary era, 1765 to 1795, and broadens the lens to include blacks and whites, patriots and loyalists, politics and warfare, and all the states, from New England to the Lower South. Women play a central part, from the enslaved Boston poet Phyllis Wheatley to Martha Washington's runaway maid, Ona Judge. This book includes a close study of two measures related to the controversy over slavery and the Revolution, the 1772 Somerset legal decision and Lord Dunmore's proclamation of 1775. Somerset, which held slavery to be so odious that nothing can be suffered to support it but positive law, found no such law in England. Slaveholders in the American colonies where such laws did exist considered Somerset derisive and unsettling. During the war, British promises of freedom for enslaved blacks who turned against their patriot owners, which began with Dunmore, added to the outrage against imperial rule. Black Americans took their chances however they could find them, fleeing or fighting for their liberty in an era turned upside down by revolution. We can gather their thinking through the voices, among others, of Wheatley, Judge, and Benjamin Banneker, and through the actions of Crispus Attucks, the first to die in the Boston Massacre, and Harry Washington, who fled from Mount Vernon to Dunmore's banner. The Revolutionary era changed the American understanding of liberty and slavery. Combining their rights-respecting English legal heritage with a New World sense of opportunity, political and economic liberty became the justification for independence and the founding ideal of the Republic. In this context, perhaps because of their experience with race-based bondage, American patriots adopted and adapted the established metaphor of slavery used by English opponents of absolutism to express all that they abhorred about imperial rule. A lack of political agency, as the original metaphor implied to its English users, gave way in American usage to images of British bondage and brutality. "We won't be their Negroes," John Adams shouted against the British during the Stamp Act crisis of 1765. Along with a sense of white liberty, black slavery in a form unlike anything in England had emerged in Britain's North American colonies and become central to the economic, political, and social life of the southern ones from Maryland to Georgia. Where is the difference between the British senator who attempts to enslave his fellow subjects in America and the American patriot who reduces his African brethren to slavery? The Philadelphia patriot and signer of the Declaration of Independence, Benjamin Rush, could ask, without the drafter of that document, Thomas Jefferson, ever offering a clear answer. Especially in northern states, a Revolutionary-era embrace of liberty fired many revivalist Protestants principled Quakers, who had long opposed slavery on egalitarian religious grounds, and reform-minded rationalists to reject race-based slavery. More so in Southern states, for slaveholders and those who did not see blacks as sufficiently American or even fully human, the Revolutionary-era emphasis on individual rights could lead to a defense of property rights in enslaved Africans. Countless black Americans heard the cries for liberty and acted on them. In the North, enslaved blacks such as Felix Holbrook and freed ones like Caesar Sartor pushed their states to live up to the promise of liberty for all. In the South, with no prospect of freedom under Patriot rule, invading British armies offered a means for personal liberation. One way or another, the American Revolution resulted in the first great emancipation of enslaved blacks in the New World, with some finding freedom under the British banner and others gaining it from a liberty-inspired retrenchment of slavery in the North. The outcome was far from uniform as Northern states moved fitfully toward abolition and Southern states doubled down on slavery. Daniel Payne witnessed the contradiction firsthand. Having fled George Washington's plantation when British troops invaded Virginia in 1780, Payne found freedom in British-occupied New York. He then watched from one of the last ships evacuating freed blacks from the city as his former enslaver entered it as a liberator in 1783. The tensions caused by differing conceptions of liberty and slavery in Northern and Southern states erupted at the Constitutional Convention, fractured state ratifying debates, and threatened to disrupt the first federal Congress. Southern leaders like South Carolina's C.C. Pinckney, a former Revolutionary War general and future two-time Federalist Party nominee for president, believed that these episodes left state-sanctioned slavery on a secure footing and primed for expansion westward. Others, like Virginia's Patrick Henry, feared for the future of slavery in a federal union dominated by anti-slavery Northerners. Building on what came before, these episodes left an enduring legacy, a distinctively American heritage of liberty and slavery, two intertwining strands of the national DNA. For all Americans living through those 3 decades, particularly for enslaved and free Americans of color, it became a time of promises kept and promises broken, hopes fulfilled and hopes dashed. Congress spoke to those promises in 1792, when the first law authorizing American coins decreed that each bear the singular motto, Liberty, an aspirational affirmation that survives to this day. Along with the long shadow of slavery, the promises and hopes for liberty endure, firing the struggle for an enhanced American inheritance going forward. E.J.L., New Haven, Connecticut, March 14, 2022. Introduction. Crèvecoeur's question. What is an American? In the beginning, all the world was America. So wrote the gaunt, sharp-nosed English philosopher John Locke in his 1689 Second Treatise of Government about a place he never saw, but played a major role in shaping. This sentence encapsulated Locke's theory that people originally found nature vacant and uncultivated and made it their property by occupying and improving it. Created free and equal, as Locke theorized, people later exchanged some of their natural liberty to form governments for the protection of their civil liberty and private property, which in turn upended social equality. The natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth, he maintained. The liberty of man in society is to be under no other legislative power but that established by consent in the Commonwealth. Locke's allusion to America drew on the view, ascendant in Britain at the time, that because Native Americans held land in common and did not improve it, Britons could make America their own through occupation and cultivation. Locke knew that because native peoples lived in America, Occupying cultivators could not take it as readily as they presumably once took the original vacant earth, but the illusion worked well enough to convey meaning to Britons who saw a rare opportunity in their occupation of New World colonies. The Spanish, Portuguese, and French held similarly self-serving views about European claims to New World lands, but by giving more weight to initial discovery by the agent of a Christian monarch rather than occupation and to papal sanction, they produced somewhat more multiracial societies in their colonies. Whether by discovery or occupation, Europeans transformed America into their property, and more controversially, by capturing Native Americans, they made them their property too. Christopher Columbus said as much about the land and its people in the diary of his first voyage to the New World, and successive generations of Europeans in America put his words into practice. Doing so gave a sense of liberty, or at least empowerment, to European Americans, but meant slavery for Native Americans. An influential English Whig theorist, who, like other Whigs of his era, championed parliamentary supremacy over royal rule, Locke wrote his treatise in opposition to the claim that God gave absolute authority to monarchs. Under his theory, at some point in the past, people voluntarily formed governments to protect life, liberty, and property. Laws ought to be designed for no other end ultimately but for the good of the people, he declared, and governments must not raise taxes on the property of the people without the consent of the people given by themselves or their deputies. Individuals cannot choose to become enslaved because it violates the natural law of liberty, Locke reasoned, and in a like manner, they have a duty to revolt against governments enslaving them by taking their property or civil liberties without consent. The reason why men enter into society is the preservation of their property, he wrote, and whenever the legislators endeavor to take away and destroy the property of the people, or to reduce them to slavery under arbitrary power, they put themselves into a state of war with the people, who are thereupon absolved from any further obedience. For Locke, the term legislators surely included monarchs, with the absolutist 17th-century British Stuart kings foremost in his mind. From the English Civil War, which ended the life of one Stuart king, through the Glorious Revolution, which ended the reign of another, English revolutionaries and Whigs freely used slavery as a metaphor for a lack of personal liberty or agency. Drawing on classical writings glorifying the civic virtues of late Republican Rome, but, unlike the Romans, usually divorced from personal experience with chattel slavery, the English portrayed it as the predictable consequence of unchecked power in the hands of state or church officials. For people genuinely held in perpetual bondage, the metaphor might seem outrageous when applied to less onerous impositions like taxation without representation. Still, it had the rhetorical force to engage listeners and potentially change the way they viewed burdens placed on them by the king or parliament. Metaphors matter because they both convey meaning and shape understanding. Actual slavery existed. In fact, over 2 million enslaved Africans had been shipped to the Americas for sale by 1700, an estimated 1/6 of these in British ships, and as an investor in the slave-trading Royal African Company, Locke profited from it. In his treatise, Locke noted that lawful conquerors could enslave captives. He termed this the perfect condition of slavery. Further, as personal secretary to one of the founding proprietors of the Carolinas, Locke helped to draft the colony's initial 1669 Constitution, which established black slavery there by positive law. Every free man of Carolina, it stated, shall have absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves. Both in theory and in practice, liberty and slavery stood as polar opposites in Whig political philosophy, with the one giving meaning to the other by way of contrast. In Locke's wake, they took similar form in revolutionary American thought, with liberty as the dream and slavery the nightmare. For Locke in the late 1600s, America offered an example of embryonic processes of political formation happening in real time. By the mid-1700s, Americans saw in his treatise the sanction to take those processes to their logical ends in revolution and independence. Locke's teachings seemed clear on civil liberty, taxation without representation, and the right to revolt and form new governments. On chattel slavery, however, colonists could take what they wanted from his mixed messaging about an institution that violated natural law, but could exist by statute. "Britons will never be slaves," citizens of the United Kingdom sang in the refrain of Rule Britannia, a popular anthem from 1740. But those same British citizens, at least in the colonies, might enslave others. Race offered a way for them to enslave others without the fear of becoming enslaved themselves. If Britons could not become slaves, then who could? Long before Europeans reached America, and for over 3 centuries thereafter, slavery persisted in the western Mediterranean, which divided Christian Europe from Islamic North Africa. In that region, Christians captured and enslaved Muslims, Muslims captured and enslaved Christians, and both trafficked in black Africans. During the late 1450s, traders from the 2 principal Catholic nations engaged in this process, Portugal and Spain, started shipping enslaved blacks directly from Africa to their New World colonies. By the 1500s, and operating within some religious restraints, both nations adapted this practice to their new American domains by enslaving native people. In his 1493 letter of discovery to his Spanish monarchs, Columbus offered to ship slaves, as many as they ordered to be shipped, and who will be from the idolaters. Most of these enslaved indigenous peoples remained in America to work on colonial plantations, as they died from overwork and Old World diseases, or escaped into lands still held by their people. Africans replaced them as enslaved labor. This occurred first in the Portuguese and Spanish areas of South America, then on the British, Dutch, and French islands of the Caribbean beginning in the early 1600s, and finally in British and Dutch North America by the late 1600s. Unrestrained by religion, local custom, or natural law, these European Americans created a form of chattel slavery for blacks harsher than any known precedent. The sheer numbers stagger the imagination. For the New World as a whole, from 1500 to 1800, an estimated 2.5 million Europeans moved there by choice, and 12 million Africans by force. For mainland British North America, those numbers stood at about 1/2 and 1/3 of a million, respectively. Many in both groups died young from disease, especially early in the settlement process, but on the mainland and much more so in the Caribbean, blacks had higher mortality rates than whites. As a result, every mainland British colony in North America except South Carolina had more free whites than enslaved blacks, in most cases considerably more. Black slavery in British North America began at Jamestown, Virginia, the first permanent English settlement in the New World. In 1619, as this story goes, 12 years after the founding of Virginia, privateers anchoring at a nearby port took 20 enslaved blacks seized from a Portuguese slave ship to Jamestown for sale. Unlike the colony's first white settlers, who famously included John Smith, no one now knows the names of the first black Virginians, and none of their descendants joined the first families of Virginia. Slavery had died out in England by then, and at first no laws defined the status of those enslaved in British North America. Their masters might treat them akin to indentured servants, but with fewer rights and held for life, or subject them to a perpetual bondage that carried on to descendants. That same year, 1619, Virginia received permission to form its House of Burgesses, the first self-governing legislature in the colonies. Through this body, Virginia could enact its own laws covering slavery, culminating with its comprehensive slave code of 1705. Until that occurred, those enslaved in the Virginia colony lived in a netherworld where some remained in hereditary servitude and others gained freedom for themselves or their descendants over time through work or with payment. A small free black community emerged on the fringes of society. In time, similar processes took place elsewhere in British North America, resulting in a mix of enslaved and free blacks in every colony. The gradual nature of this process, particularly as it unfolded along the Chesapeake's eastern shore, where at least some free blacks secured a measure of social status, prompted some historians to posit that chattel slavery fueled anti-black racism rather than the reverse, that slavery was born of racism. Poor whites worked alongside enslaved blacks in early Virginia, and there are hints that the two despised groups initially saw each other as sharing the same predicament, the eminent historian Edmund Morgan wrote in his 1975 book, American Slavery, American Freedom. If free men with disappointed hopes should make common cause with slaves of desperate hopes, he noted, colonial elites had reason to fear for their property, power, and position. The answer to the problem, Morgan asserted, was racism, to separate dangerous free whites from dangerous slave blacks by a screen of racial contempt. Enactment of racist slave codes and legal limits on all blacks successfully dissociated them from whites, he argued, and consolidated blacks in a single pariah group. In short, Morgan wrote, the Virginia Assembly deliberately did what it could to foster the contempt of whites for blacks. A different origin story for American slavery emerged in South Carolina, where Locke's Constitution anticipated African slavery. By the time of that colony's founding in 1670, Barbados had emerged as the richest and most populated British colony in the New World. Sugar and slavery were the bases of its prosperity. During the 1500s, the center of sugar production for the European market had migrated from Spanish and Portuguese islands off the African coast to Portuguese Brazil, taking black slavery with it. Again carrying black workers along, it expanded in the 1600s to include the West Indies, starting with British Barbados. Established in 1627 on a fertile island with few native inhabitants at the extreme southeastern end of the West Indies, the colony struggled until the introduction of sugarcane, sugar processing technology, and enslaved blacks from Brazil in 1640. A capital and labor-intensive industry with brutal work and harsh conditions, sugar production flourished on large plantations using slave labor. During the 1660s, Barbados dealt with its influx of black labor by adopting a series of statutes making it the first British domain anywhere to authorize chattel slavery. Enslaved blacks and their descendants, through the mother, became the absolute and perpetual property of their masters. For Britons, who will never be slaves, to accept these laws, they must have viewed blacks differently from whites because no British statutes ever applied to whites, even the much maligned Irish, and in Barbados such laws, targeted and applied only to blacks, appeared almost spontaneously upon the arrival of the first black workers. In short, to paraphrase Morgan, black Africans came to America as a pariah group. Slavery did not make them one. The Irish and other Europeans might become indentured servants, but never enslaved. Africans typically became enslaved rather than indentured. All this mattered for South Carolina because, casting about for settlers to populate their new colony and hoping to create a lucrative plantation economy, its proprietors recruited British Barbadian smallholders, pushed off their land by the expansion of large sugar plantations. Enticed by Locke's Constitution, which assured each of them absolute power and authority over his Negro slaves, and promises of extra land for everyone they brought, These white Barbadians began arriving in South Carolina with their enslaved blacks and slave code experience as early as 1680. At the time, no one even knew what plantation crop could thrive in the marshy low country around Charleston. By 1690, they found it in rice, which proved as brutalizing to produce as sugar, and similarly dependent on slave labor. That year, Carolina enacted a slave code modeled on Barbadian law. From South Carolina, those laws spread to other mainland colonies in the American South, including Virginia. By the Revolutionary era in America, it little mattered which came first, racism or slavery. The two existed side by side and reinforced each other. British Americans, like Britons everywhere, proclaimed that they will never be slaves. By direct experience, they knew better than did Britons in the United Kingdom precisely what slavery meant. Yet they generally accepted it for blacks. Indeed, returning to London from a missionary trip to Virginia and Barbados around 1670, an English minister noted that the two words Negro and slave had by custom grown homogeneous and convertible there. By the start of the American Revolution, enslaved blacks made up over 1/5 of the population in the 13 rebel colonies. South Carolina counted 3 enslaved blacks for every 2 free whites. In Virginia, the ratio stood at 2 to 3. Enslaved blacks constituted a third or more of the non-Native American population in Georgia, North Carolina, and Maryland as well. The ratio stood at over 1 in 10 in New York, where the original patroons, drawing on the Dutch colonial experience in the Caribbean, emphasized plantation agriculture. New York had more black residents than any other northern colony. Each colony had its own local laws authorizing and governing slavery, with those in the American South most closely following Caribbean models. From its informal beginnings at Jamestown in 1619 through its development as a fundamental component of the plantation economy in the southern colonies, African slavery had become a distinctive feature of law and society throughout British North America by the mid-1700s. Beginning in the 1760s, during the run-up to the American Revolution, in speeches, essays, promulgations, and private letters, Patriot leaders demanded their liberty as British subjects while denouncing their alleged enslavement by Parliament. Although they meant these cries for white audiences, enslaved blacks heard them too. Joined by free blacks, they turned the rhetoric of liberty against their masters. In 1765, for example, as white colonists paraded through Charleston, South Carolina, protesting British stamp taxes with chants of "Liberty, Liberty," the future revolutionary leader Henry Laurens wrote, "Some enslaved blacks turned out and mimicked their betters in crying out liberty," causing anxious civic officials to put the city under guard for a week. Many white Americans saw little connection between freedom for themselves and slavery for blacks. It has been, of late, a very general practice to talk of slavery among those who are setting at defiance every power that keeps the world in order. English lexicographer Samuel Johnson sneered about American patriots in 1775. It would be vain to prohibit the use of the word slavery, but I wish it more discreetly uttered by those who actually practiced it. Some Americans agreed. Where is the difference between the British senator who attempts to enslave his fellow subjects in America by imposing taxes upon them contrary to law and justice, and the American patriot who reduces his African brethren to slavery, contrary to justice and humanity? Philadelphia patriot Benjamin Rush asked in 1773. Can we reconcile the exercise of slavery with our professions of freedom? Quaker loyalist Richard Wells added a year later. Can we suppose that the people of England will grant the force of our reasoning when they are told that every colony on the continent is deeply involved with the inconstant practice of keeping their own fellow creatures in perpetual bondage? Even as the number of enslaved Africans reaching British North America surged during the 3 decades leading up to the American Revolution, immigrants poured into the colonies from Germany, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Prior to 1700, except for pockets of Dutch, French, and Swedish settlers.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?